This is our best-selling book. It's the Accelerate Weight Loss. I know we've done at least about 25,000.
Books, DVDs, and CDs are a few of the dozens of products with Pastor Dukes and his wife on the cover. The couple who started the Harvest Life Changers ministry may not be superstars outside of this megachurch, but today they have so many followers that they've outgrown their building. Just 10 years ago, Lyle preached for a few faithful in a high school. Now, plans are in the works to build a new $45 million home for his congregation.
It's going to have a 4,000-seat sanctuary, a food court, an educational area, a children's area, a gym.
In the meantime, the pastor will have to make do with the current sanctuary. It seats 700 and fills up 3 times every Sunday. Today, there are 1,300 mega churches in the United States, twice as many as 10 years ago. Each has a charismatic leader and bases services on a literal reading of the Bible. 44% of Americans identify themselves as Protestant, and recent studies show evangelicals who attend churches like this one represent over half of that population. The number of evangelicals jumped from 200,000 in 1990 to more than 8 million today. Pastor Lyle says the church can play an especially important role in people's lives in tough economic times.
People have lost their jobs, they're foreclosing on their houses, and they just need some help. They need some help. They come to the church, we're able to settle their spirits, to pray for them, to give them some instructions, and even sometimes help them out.
Studies also show secularism gaining ground in the U.S., with a growing number of Americans saying they're unaffiliated with any religion. Despite this trend, America is still overwhelmingly a nation of believers, with 80% of the population identifying themselves with specific faiths.
What a privilege it is to be serving the living God. Now, as I've been saying over the last several broadcasts, that we are moving into a new dispensation. The battle cry has sounded, and now the battle cry is being pounded. So this is battle cry pounding, also known as battle cry sounding. But the point of it is that God is moving in a way that a lot of people are not expecting Him to move. Now, if we go back here where our text is today, in Deuteronomy 32, we'll see that what's happening here in this land of America, and even in a lot of places in this world, that God's own people have brought to the earth by their disobedience His wrath and His fury and His indignation. Because you know, the Bible tells us that judgment begins at the house of God. And so we're going to read here in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and we'll start in verse 15. But let me give you the name of this message, which is Fat, Thick, and Gorged. And this was God's evaluation of His own people, that they had grown fat, thick, and gorged, and were, as a consequence, displeasing Him. So we are living in a time in America when obesity is at an all-time high. In other words, people, even in the natural, have taken on this trait of getting fat and thick and gorged, whereby they are not sensitive to anything. And we can get that way in the spirit, whereby we refuse to listen to God, or we just push him off like what he wants doesn't matter, but what we want matters. Huh? Now, how many of you know that the appetite is a power of its own? How many of you ever experienced that appetite has its own motivation? Okay? You can say, well, I'm just going to eat one boiled egg for lunch, one piece of toast, and one sprig of lettuce. And then you come to lunch, and you end up eating a dozen boiled eggs, 2 loaves of bread, and 4 heads of lettuce. Well, 1 sprig of lettuce. For those of you who hate vegetables. I love vegetables, but if you hate vegetables, then you could, you know. And so then you wonder why the retributive justice of a stomach ache, of a headache, you know, if you eat all those eggs, you're going to get a cholesterol headache. And if you eat all that bread, even if it's toasted, it's going to cause you trouble because it's got to get through you. And so if you only eat 1 sprig of lettuce, you're not giving much contact power for that stuff to get moving. But the point I'm getting to is that appetite took over and you pay for it. Now, when we get fat, and I'm not just talking about natural corpulence, but when we get fat, there are things that come in that disturb our bodies, that disturb our minds, that disturb our motivation. Now, if you've ever watched naturally fat people walk, it's an effort. Young or old, well, you don't see too many fat people too old because they die before then because their body systems can't stand any more of it. But the point is that it is exertion. Now, walking is not meant to be exertion. It's a natural function that God gave us in order to mobilize. That's how we're supposed to get from one spot to another, is by walking. Now, there's some people that think, well, I don't need to really walk because I can buy me a little cart, or I can get me, you know, some kind of mobile unit, and I can just buzz the button and shoot over there. But who's going to get you up out of that thing? See, when you're weighing 500, somebody's got to get you up out of it because you can't lift your own weight. But the point I'm getting to is you get immobile. You get real dull because of that encumbrance. Now, we can get fat in the spiritual sense, whereby the Bible tells us to beware of those weights and sins that do so easily beset us. We can get weighted down and therefore immobile with God, thick and dull and not responsive to God, and thinking it doesn't matter if we move with God. Because why? Because we've gotten fat, see, and we've gotten encumbered, and we've gotten hindered. Now, in Deuteronomy 32, verse 15, this is a magnificent verse. I'm reading it out of the Amplified Version, and it says here, but Jeshurun, Israel, grew fat and kicked. It says you became fat, you grew thick, you were gorged and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and forsook and despised the rock of his salvation. Now, this is the truth. I'm from another era, another dispensation of time, another century. When I grew up, fat was not exhibited as it is now. And I believe it's because the nation was more biblically sound than now. Now it's biblically illiterate. But in those days, there was more knowledge of what the Scripture had to say than there is now. So if you were fat, you tried to hide it if you went out in public. It was just the way things were. And you take a picture, I mean, we had a calendar that was from the 50s, and it had a photograph of a sheriff's department in one of these New Mexico towns. And every one of those sheriffs and sheriff's deputies was thin, slender. Okay? Now when you see police officers, what's the first thing you see? Donut. You see the donut. And you got this head and this chest, and then you got the big donut circling. Okay? And the donut rolls from one place to another to get some more donuts. But the point I'm getting to is that in those days, fat was not something to be proud of. Now we get to see it every single weekend, exhibition of rolls. You know, big fat nasties hanging out everywhere, and people are not ashamed of it, they're proud of it. They strut that stuff. Huh? Even if they could barely waddle, they'll just move from side to side so you can see the fat hanging on them. And then they'll get big old slimy tattoos on it, you know, so you can see it personified. Now, what is that? That's the exhibition of it. That's the glorification of it. That's the pride of it. Okay? Big, fat, nasty, and proud of it. Why are they nasty? Because if you're too fat, you have a hard time cleaning your own body. I knew one gentleman, and he told me that many times he helped his wife extract the mold from her rolls. His wife was a professional woman, held a job, wore clothing, but she got mold in her rolls. And he said many times he'd help her to get the mold out of her rolls. Yeah, that's true love, I guess. I don't know. Mold in the fold. But the point I'm getting to is that the nastiness of exhibiting this, when God has such an indictment against us, against it, here in Deuteronomy 32 verse 15, what did he say? He said, when you got that way, when you got fat and thick and gorged and sleek, what did you do? You forsook God and you despised God. Now, what does all this fat mean? I'm going to give you the meanings, but what does it really mean? It means that you indulged self. Now, we are in the New Testament, folks, so we could say, well, this doesn't apply. Oh, yes, it does, because Jesus, the first command that he gave was, deny yourself. Come on. He said, deny yourself. In other words, resist the impulse, the lust, the desire of self, and be subject to me. Take on a new master. Take on my headship, my lordship, my desire, my will, and deny yourself. So, when you get fat and thick and gorged and sleek, you are obviously not denying self. Now, what's happened to the land of America? Fat is where it's at. And I'm not just talking about naturally. You look at these churches, many of them are spread out, covering massive acres of ground. And there's no Spirit of God there. They've gotten too fat to have any sensitivity to God. Huh?
What is a megachurch? The church in America for decades has been labeled a place of judgment and condemnation and shaming and guilt. And it makes it very hard to get up and come back to the church if you think when you get there, all you're going to get is condemned, slapped up one side and down the other. It's not about buildings, it's not about size, it's not about music, it's not about whether we wear ties or socks. 60, 70, 80% of your congregation are not even professing believers.
60, 70, 80% of your congregation are not even professing believers.
Now you can't be the church because there's more of them than there are of you.
Do we really need those things in a church? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just a bit distracted. Got a little ice cream there.
Massive acres of ground, and there's no Spirit of God there. They've gotten too fat to have any sensitivity to God. Huh? God says, this is what I'm doing, and they're over here doing this. because they're too thick, too dull to hear God. And maybe they don't care about God. Maybe they don't care about God. Why? Because they're too full of self. They're too full of giving the worldlings the world and claiming they're Christian. They're too fat of living the good life, of having everything the way they want it. Listen, if you're going to follow Jesus Christ,